So thank you everyone for joining today. This is our June 2021 Midwest Cybersecurity Alliance meeting. Next slide, please, Allison. So today, as we always do, we're going to do a brief introduction to what the Midwest Cybersecurity Alliance is, some housekeeping and continuing education credits so you can get credit. Then we'll jump into today's topics, and we always leave time at the end to do Q&A and networking. Next slide, please. So for background, the Midwest Cybersecurity Alliance is a nonprofit organization that myself and others formed many, many years ago, really to deal with cybersecurity issues, but not just to address them from a legal perspective or an IT perspective, but also from a risk management perspective, and really bring in all players to the space so that when we come up to solutions for cybersecurity, it's not in a vacuum. Here is the link to the Midwest Cybersecurity Alliance website. We do post all of our presentations to that site afterwards, and all of our prior presentations are listed there. Next slide, please.
All right, I'll jump in here on Jen's behalf. So just a quick notice that we are recording today's program. And as Jen mentioned, we will be posting that to the MCSA website behind the member login wall. That login is completely free if you don't already have a login. So if you want to access the materials after the fact, you just need to sort of enter a name and email address, and you'll be able to access those presentations. The slide deck from today will also be made available. It will also be on the Foley website within a couple of days, and then we'll send an email to registrants as well that has a link to the deck as well. So those will be made available, but just wanted to let everyone know that we are recording today's session. Hopefully most people at this point have used Microsoft Teams before, but for those who might not have used this platform before, just a reminder, as Jen mentioned, please keep your microphone on mute and your camera off just to avoid distractions during the substantive part of the presentations. But we do want to make it interactive, so if you have questions or if we get to the networking portion at the end, of course, please open it back up and show yourselves and chat with us a little bit. So if you do have questions, you can either use the raise your hand function within Teams, or you can certainly just speak up by unmuting yourself. You can also type some questions in the chat widget. That there's a show conversation button up at the top. There's a chat bubble that looks like that. So you can go ahead and just type your questions in that way. I will also be typing in some CLE related comments and links to the forums and whatnot. So if you are seeking CLE credit for today's program, just make sure you check the chat window for those links. And then again, if you're experiencing any issues, if you're joining by web browser, please just try refreshing your browser to see if that alleviates any audio or video issues. And then also just a reminder for those who have not attended an MCSA meeting before, we do offer continuing education credits. For those who are licensed attorneys here in the US, we do continuing legal education credits. So I've got some links here, and then like I said, mentioned before, I'll provide the links in the chat box. Anyone who is seeking CLE credit for today's program will need you to download this attorney affirmation form. I will have a couple of course codes that I will read aloud towards the end of the program, and we just need you to fill those into the attorney affirmation form, fill out your bar state and license number, and send that back to us via email after the program. And then we'll be distributing certificates for qualified attendees within about 8 weeks after the program. And then if you are seeking certified privacy education credit, we do have an ISACA verification form as well. That is self-reporting, so you just download that and use it, I think, just in the background as potential audit material, or you can upload it to their site if that's what they request. But we do have that available too. I'll provide the link here in a moment. Any questions, you can feel free to reach out to me. And with that, I'll kick it back over to Jen.
Thank you so much, Allison. And obviously, Allison is going to be monitoring the chat, so any sort of questions, please just put that in there. As we start with all of these sessions, we just want you to be aware that Foley posts a free 50-state data breach chart on all the different state data breach laws, and we update that 4 times a year. You can just simply Google it at this site, and it comes up. Next slide, please, Allison. the way it works is you pick your state, and remember, when you have a data incident, it's not just the state in which your company is located, it's actually depends on the states of the individuals affected. Next slide, please, Allison. And then, for example, here in Wisconsin, it pulls up the relevant law. We mention this each time because a lot of people do use this. With qualifications is that not every single piece of the data breach law is listed in this chart, but at least it's a good resource for background. Next slide, please, Allison. So before we get into this incredibly hot topic about ransomware, which literally I get multiple questions every day on, is we always like to start these sessions out talking about some other hot topics that are in and going around in the data, cybersecurity and privacy space. So I just wanted to mention a couple things. We have done various sessions on the developing privacy laws, in particular California's CCPA. And we've also highlighted the differences with the new California law, CPRA, which is not in effect yet. But since that time, Virginia has also, instituted a law, still not effective till 1/1/23. But we also have Colorado coming into play. In fact, even today, we just heard that Connecticut had a law as well, but it did not pass. So the reason why I bring this up is that similar to the 50-state data breach notification chart, we're now getting into a space where we're dealing with multiple privacy laws jumping up on the state level. And in fact, in the fall, we always take a break over the summer with the Midwest Cybersecurity Alliance, but our programming will be coming back in the fall. And we will definitely be hosting a session on all of these new privacy laws and what does that mean to your organization. So I wanted to point that out to everyone. Also, another very relevant development is under GDPR in the European space. I'm sure you've been following this, but many different types of data transfer mechanisms have been found to be invalid through Schrems 1, Schrems 2. And we do want to let you know that there is recent guidance coming out on standard contractual clauses, which is a common form of data transfer mechanism that many organizations use. They've issued new SCCs. We're coming out with new guidance, about SCCs, and the EDPB has also issued additional guidance. So if you are in the European space and dealing with GDPR, those are some of the hot issues. I will offer it up to the group now and also at the end. If there's anything else that's going on locally or other things people want to mention about new sessions coming up, please feel free to jump in either now or at the end. We are going to reinvigorate the IAPP, the International Association of Privacy Professionals, is hosting its PSR meeting in San Diego in the fall in October. Various individuals from Foley will be out there. If you are attending, please reach out and let Allison or I know. We would like to do some sort of client get together out in San Diego. But if anybody else has any sort of news or upcoming programs, we do this in person, feel free to jump on before we jump into our program. All right, well, hearing none of that, we can leave that to the end. Let's get started. So ransomware. What does it mean to your organization? Today, we have such a great group of panelists, and I just want to thank them so very much. Ransomware is incredibly difficult issue to deal with, not just from an operations perspective, but the whole ecosystem is very hard to navigate. And I am so happy today to have both Aon and Stroh's to help us here at Foley address the issue, because again, it's not just a legal issue or a technical issue. It really pops up in all different areas. So what we're going to do today is we're going to cover ransomware and what does it mean from a cyber insurance perspective. Then I'm going to talk through, just generally speaking, when you're dealing with a ransomware event, what are some unique things that are different than just a typical malware, event. My partner, Christopher Swift, is really going to focus in on some of the OFAC considerations about potentially paying a terrorist group and what you can and cannot do and what are the related penalties. And then we're going to have Che talk about really some technical best practices to prepare for and respond to ransomware. And we're going to pause as we go because, like I said before, we really want to make this interactive. And I'm sure many, many of you, since the White House has issued open letter to private entities, are getting a lot of questions from either your board or executive management. So let's dive in. Next slide, please, Allison. I'm going to do quick introductions and then I'm going to go around the room and then we'll start off with Steph. So I'm Jen Urban. I've been practicing a long time in the cybersecurity and privacy space. I'm a partner at Foley and Lardner and I am located in the Milwaukee office. I'm going to turn over to Christopher, who is not on video because he is so dedicated to this area. And unfortunately, I've been bugging him all week while he is on vacation. But he is one of our national security experts, and he's literally on vacation. So he's not joining by video, but I'll turn it over to you, Christopher.
Thank you, Jen. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Christopher Swift. I'm a partner in Foley and Lardner's government enforcement, defense, and investigations practice. Essentially, what I am is a white-collar international and national security lawyer. So when the FBI or OFAC or other 3 and 4 large black Suburbans that wrap around sunglasses, that's when Jen and the cybersecurity team will get involved. A little bit of background on me. I was in federal service for a number of years at the White House and then later at the U.S. Treasury Department. My last in the federal government was enforcing sanctions, on writing some of the sanctions rules at OFAC. And then when I'm not doing that stuff, I am teaching national security law at Georgetown University, often to feds, to folks in private sectors as well. So Jen, thanks for the introduction, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to join you today.
Thank you, Che.
Jen, thank you very much again for the opportunity. So delighted to be a part of this. And you know, as you know, many of our clients and folks are reaching out, just looking for guidance or just expertise around, you know, what we're hearing about in the news every day, right? These ransomware attacks, and so just so delighted to be partnering with the Foley team and to share some expertise around what we're seeing as a firm. And certainly what we're recommending. Just by way of introduction, I'm one of the VPs here at Strauss Freeburg, now part of Aon Cyber Solutions, and I lead a lot of the breach and incident response and investigative work that comes into the company. And when I'm not doing that, I serve as an adjunct faculty at 3 different universities: Marquette, Loyola, and Washington University in St. Louis.
And Steph?
Hi, everyone. I am Steph Dingman, and I am a managing director in our Aon Cyber Solutions team. I focus on helping clients transfer their cyber and errors and omissions risk via insurance, but work very closely with Che and other colleagues within our broader cyber solutions team to help bring the right solution to our clients wherever they may need help when a cyber event occurs. So I'm looking forward to being with you here today.
Thank you so much. So let's just dive on in. And Steph, if you want to start out, I'm going to jump off camera, but I'll jump back on for some questions. And then after we go through the cyber insurance intro and piece, we're going to hold for questions before we get into the legal piece. Thank you.
Great. Yep. Thank you. So I think, you know, everyone is well aware of, you know, the ransomware attacks that have been so prevalent in the news lately. We put a few examples here on this slide, but certainly they seem to be occurring on a daily basis. And, you know, what we're finding in our space from an insurance risk transfer perspective, when one of these events happens, there's sort of a knee-jerk reaction that ripples across the market pretty quickly. So for example, when CNA had their shutdown essentially for a couple weeks, we were actually renewing some other large insurance company towers for cyber, and had carriers actually pull quotes and rethink what they were willing to do for the renewal. And it really became a challenge for any of our brokers who were trying to renew a financial institution or insurance company type tower at that time. It really became a challenge. I would say with the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, that also became a challenge across the board for a lot of our clients who are in the anywhere in the supply chain around that. And again, we saw a lot of, I'll just keep saying knee-jerk reactions, but a lot of like just concern that our underwriters don't quite know how to price for this, and that these ransomware attacks are coming in faster and more frequently than they can possibly sort of keep up with. So, there's just a couple examples of ransomware attacks that have happened, and like I said, there's more happening every day. I feel like every day we wake up and see what's next. But the techniques that the bad actors are using is kind of evolving over time, I would say. It used to be that they would just get into the system and or maybe sort of like do a scattershot approach to try to get to as many organizations as possible. And what we're seeing now is the attacks are just much more sophisticated than that. The bad actors are actually going in and kind of staying in the system for a while. They're getting access to admin accounts. They're actually even impersonating some of the bad actors to try to gain credibility. There's just so much going on that, you really do need an expert to help you navigate this should you have a ransomware attack that hits you. Put up a few statistics here. Every 11 seconds. I mean, some countries, some organizations, this is all they do for a living now. They don't need to go out and do anything but sit at a computer and try to find ways into people's systems. So it's become a very, very problematic situation for our industry. I think the piece about the customers wanting to stop dealing with a business if they do have a cybersecurity event is truly something that we're going to keep monitoring. There's a lot of concern about public relations and reputational harm. Some of our policies do have a little bit of coverage for this, but at the end of the day, if your clients lose confidence in you, you can be in a really tough position to get them back. So we are working through all of this with our clients, but on the next page, I'll dive a little deeper into the actual, and maybe I don't know if I need to advance it. There we go. Into the actual things we're seeing from the underwriters. So what historically happened, if you can imagine, is our underwriters, started taking applications for cyber insurance and didn't really think about how to quantify the risk. And so they were, throwing numbers out there, trying to write business, write premium. And now what we're seeing is this trend of claims happening both from a frequency and severity perspective. And that's leading to a much greater scrutiny of the underwriting process that's happening behind the scenes with our underwriters. So claims frequency, we're just seeing this go up and up. And this is where we need experts from both the legal perspective, the forensics perspective, the negotiators with the when there's a ransomware payment, people who pay Bitcoin, all of these different vendors that you end up working with when you have an incident are becoming more and more players. So claims frequency, severity is also going up. I think we saw big numbers on the previous page, but ransomware related events, it's not just the cost of the ransomware payment that can be covered under an insurance policy. It's the forensics associated with it. It's the legal and expert opinions around that. But also, if there's a network business interruption loss and there's lost net income or extra expense that's occurring, that can be picked up under a cyber policy. So what we're starting to see is that the severity of these claims is playing out, and the underwriters are looking back and saying, oh my goodness, we haven't charged anywhere near enough for this risk, and we need to rethink how we're pricing this completely. So pricing, next quadrant, is certainly going up. We are seeing that in 2020, from 2019 to 2020, it was going up maybe 5 to 10%. What we're seeing right now is anywhere from 30 to 300% increases, to be honest. It is absolutely tricky for us to predict where a renewal might end up. It is heavily dependent on the next bullet, which is risk selection, meaning what the controls that company has in place is. It really drives the pricing and the consideration of the markets in general, whether they're even willing to put any limit up on that risk. So the risk selection piece, what I would say there is underwriters are getting smarter about the questions that they're asking. They have put together ransomware supplemental applications that they're requiring from all of their insureds. And what we did at Aon was we took all of those different applications and combined them into a streamlined ransomware application so that we can really help our clients navigate their answers, look through, try to improve their security posture before they even get to the renewal. So we are really trying to work hard to put our clients in the best position for a favorable renewal. But it's been a little tricky because the questions keep evolving. You have a SolarWinds incident, and then there's a SolarWinds question. You have the next incident comes up, and they're pivoting on what they're asking about. So I don't know if we can mute who's ever talking, but so bottom line is we expect this to continue throughout 2021. Our market is hard, continues to harden, and we are challenged time and again to find capacity for our clients that don't have good controls in place. It's gotten to the point now where if you don't have the basic multi-factor authentication controls, that we can't even get you coverage. If we look at the next slide, we can see the prevalence of ransomware compared to a data breach or privacy event. Now, granted, a ransomware event can lead to a data breach of sorts. This graph is really designed to show the initial trigger of what caused the policy to come into effect. And more often than not, what we're seeing is that it's actually a ransomware triggered event, as opposed to simply I lost this file or I sent this file to the wrong person, and it's sort of more traditional data breach and privacy. So you can see on this slide just the prevalence of ransomware. Why we're talking about it today in general at all is because of this prevalence of an increase here today. So if we flip to the next slide, we can get into a little bit more about how are these bad actors getting into the system. And I'm going to give a high level here and then maybe ask Che to comment a little bit from his perspective. What happens is if a client has a situation, we try to loop in resources that we have on our team to help navigate the breach or the ransomware event as well. And Che is definitely, as he mentioned, one of those folks. So it can be a phishing email where the attackers, send in a phishing event. I actually just got one today that looked like it was from our IT service help desk. And I was like, that doesn't look quite right. So I put it over to junk mail. I'm going to see what they come back with once they do their assessment. But this is where employees are the weakest link and generally click on the link and, cause the initial infiltration. Remote access has been a huge challenge. I was mentioning multi-factor authentication. I think as COVID hit and people started to work from home more and more, we saw an increase in the amount of ability for bad actors to get into systems because the multi-factor authentication that had been rolled out in a particular organization wasn't nearly as robust as it should have been and needed to be. And so the bad actors were able to find ways into the system. My husband's company actually had a situation where a woman they sent a blast email and the HR leader got an email. She happened to be out on maternity leave, and they sent her a note to log into her Gmail. She did that thinking they were telling her, the steps to take. This is like, it looked like it was from the company. It was about an invoice. Sorry to backtrack a little bit, but it was about an invoice. And they sent her and said, well, can you just log in from your Gmail? Go to your Gmail, send us your password. We'll log in. We'll get there. They ended up with her credentials. And sure enough, there was, a six-figure payment. No, it was a six-figure payment that went out because they had her credentials and were able to authorize something. And it was especially vulnerable because she was on a maternity leave and didn't realize that there was something wrong with what was happening. So, things like this are very common. And in this remote access world that we're in, they didn't have their MFA buttoned up well enough to ensure that didn't happen. And then just plain old vulnerabilities, exploiting any vulnerability, unpatched servers, software that's reached its end of life and isn't being upgraded any further. So, these are the main ways that we're seeing bad actors get into systems. But I don't know, Che, if you had any other commentary that you wanted to share on that.
Yes, Steph, I think you did an amazing job just kind of talking through the vectors that are being used by the attackers today. I guess the only thing that I would add is to the point made about remote access and COVID. What we saw when organizations in all industries and all verticals were sort of lifting and shifting to support their workforces to work remotely. There was a huge push to get all of that up and running as quickly as possible. And so there was, the focus was getting the technology up and running, procuring the technology, and maybe less of the security that goes into the deployment of these remote access technologies, whatever it is that these organizations decided to leverage. And so they've sort of been in operational mode, since COVID, and because of the criticality of the technologies, because we're, most of us are still working remotely. That there's not really a huge sort of interest to, invoke security controls or additional defenses or do things of that nature. And so, if you're an attacker and you're thinking about, okay, well, how do I evolve my business plan, right? Because that's really what this is it's a business for them. What can I do different to be able to get in, and where do I see there being vulnerabilities? Well, this is a great example of that, right? And so, they've been taking advantage of this all day long, and getting into networks. And while, they may not be doing anything after they actually conduct the intrusion, the fact is they're in, right? They built persistence. They have that sort of backdoor into the organization that they're in. And so we've seen this really prevalent. We also see this a lot because a lot of organizations, especially those in Wisconsin, are manufacturers and that really is sort of the types of organizations that are really prevalent here in the state. And they may have amazing technical people, but not necessarily people that are focused on security and leading sort of the security around that, and so they don't have a lot of that security input. So you may have like a director of IT or a CIO or a VP of IT or something of that nature. Again, doing all the right things from a technology perspective and doing whatever they can on the technology side and on the security side, but there's not a huge focus on that. And so again, we see that introducing vulnerabilities here and there. And then lastly, on the vulnerabilities piece, if you for all the technical people that are participating, you all know what a CVE is, a common vulnerability exposure, and how frequently CVEs are being released. So it's for the non-technical people, every time a vulnerability is sort of released and made aware, there's a CVE, sort of a marking around that particular vulnerability and helpful information about that. we see more vulnerabilities now being disclosed on sort of security technologies and edge technologies and things of that nature, right? So when you have these systems that are on the internet facing environment that are completely vulnerable, and folks are not patching it, or folks can't patch it because they don't have necessarily the downtime or the approval from change management to be able to do that. Now you've got equipment on the internet edge that's completely vulnerable and subject to attack by an attacker. So that's just the additional context that I would add, Steph. Just working many of the incidents that come into the company.
Yep. If we flip to the next page, we can see kind of the main focus areas that the underwriters are looking at for this ransomware supplemental application that I'm mentioning over and over again. Very much more detail and more, sort of scrutiny around, are you really buttoned up here or not? We've got clients that'll say, I can't put multi-factor authentication on because it's going to slow our business down. We're not, it causes people delay or whatever. We've got clients that are, scrambling to try to get it in place before renewal because they know they're behind the times. But these are all the kind of key areas that we're seeing as critical from an underwriting perspective that I would just share with you. And I know we'll be touching on a number of these as we continue on throughout the presentation. But this is, the things that we get questions about a lot and that our clients need to be prepared to answer. I think, the phishing exercise and cyber awareness training is becoming more critical because we're finding that, like I said earlier, that employees still are the weak link, and that causes a lot of angst. I mean, if that HR director that I mentioned hadn't questioned, why am I giving my password over my Gmail account? I don't know, she probably should have questioned that, but she didn't at the time. So all of these points are, again, key areas. Now, if you think about it from an underwriting perspective, they may not be the technical people that, some of the forensics firms employ. What they're doing is they're looking at the claims experience and seeing what the commonalities are there, and then asking questions. When they start to see that multi-factor authentication is 90% of the ransomware involve a multi-factor authentication lapse, they're going to ask more and more questions about that. The other thing they do rely on is third-party vendors to help them analyze the risk and do better underwriting. And then they also are sometimes hiring their own risk engineers to help sit in on underwriting calls and understand how a client is buttoned up and whether they have specific concerns. So we've seen sort of an evolution on the underwriting side of how they're trying to understand the risk and get better about this. So if we flip to the next slide, we can just, the main thing on this, there's same left and right, but it's just from a hard market perspective, what we're seeing. And I've already touched on some of this. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but the yellow or orangish arrows kind of give you a sense of what we're dealing with and how we're having to have tough conversations with clients. We are seeing, retentions go up. That's how much a client retains in order to protect, themselves. So if you think of your auto deductible, you've got a certain amount of retention that you take, and then the carrier kicks in. It's the same concept. So those retentions are going up. The limits and sublimits are generally going down. So clients who used to put up, say, a $10 million limit are now coming down to a $5 million limit. And clients who used to have maybe a full limit on something now are getting a sublimit added in. So we're seeing basically that contraction of coverage happening time and again. Coinsurance wasn't really around in the soft market, and we're seeing it now on specifically to ransomware events. So their AIG specifically is adding generally a 50% coinsurance around a ransomware event, which means that the client has to basically go 50% up the tower and pay half of any ransomware loss. And that's a new issue that we're dealing with in our market now. The rates, this is premium, obviously going up, as I mentioned, more exclusions, more concerns around, like I said, solar winds, anything else, end of use or end of life types technology. And then breadth of coverage is going down. They're pulling back. It used to be we could get more and more added every time we went through a renewal, and now what we're seeing is a contraction of that. So this just gives you a sense of kind of the challenges that we're dealing with here. It's been pretty brutal. I think we like to think we can solve all our clients' problems, but for clients, like I said before, that don't have multi-factor authentication, this has been so extremely challenging to get them a good insurance product that sometimes we even say, like, look, why don't you go button up your IT security posture, and then we'll get you insurance once you're in a better spot. So that's a tough message to send to a client, but we've had to do it time and again. On the last slide that for my part that we wanted to touch on real quick was just what our markets are saying. So we are surveying our key trading partners and trying to get a sense of where they think we're going to be from a rate increase perspective. And what I would tell you is this looks actually not bad to me compared to what we're actually seeing. It's actually worse than this, and we're working on updating it right now because it's gotten even tougher than this. We're seeing a lot of, I just had a renewal where we had a guidance that it would be a 40% increase. They came back with a 200% increase, and we were able to negotiate back down to a 90% increase, and somehow that felt like a win. So these are the kinds of things we're dealing with in the insurance space. But I'm happy to take any questions if we have them at this moment, or just pipe in throughout the rest of the conversation.
Thanks, Steph. That was awesome. I do have a question. I mean, we're getting a lot of clients reaching out to us, in particular our insurance team, about that the cost is going up through the roof. And so they're all going through a review process right now with their cyber insurance. And I always tell them, and I'm glad that lawyers are getting a lot more involved, as well, when the technical team is doing, for example, the supplemental application. And for all lawyers and IT people on the phone or risk managers, I mean, it really needs all three types of individuals looking at those cyber insurance renewals. And when individuals fill out these applications, it really needs to be a coordinated effort, because we don't want to have any issues on the back end where we can't get reimbursement or coverage based on answers, or in fact, the premiums are just so very high if the questions are not answered accurately and truthfully. So I don't know, and maybe Che, I think you help a lot of companies as well kind of run through their cybersecurity applications. And so if you have any other practical advice there, I think that would be useful for the group.
Yeah, sure. Steph, you want to maybe kick off, and then I can add some additional color on
that? Sure. Yeah, we're trying to, that's partly what the impetus was for us creating that Aon supplemental application, so that we could get it out in a consistent way to our clients, help them, answer consistently, and then we can review their answers and help them. I mean, sometimes it's like, did you say no, meaning like no, except 95% of the time it's a yes, and we can help, clarify that question a little bit, or did you say no and you really mean no, we don't have MFA. So we are reviewing, we're training our brokers to review that. We pull in resources like Jay and his team when we need a little more technical expertise. But we're helping our clients review that application before we go to market, so that we have the story aligned and we have as good of a story as we possibly can tell, prepared for the market. So I don't know, Che, what you would add to that, but it is definitely becoming part of our broker's job to help understand where a client is at from a cybersecurity standpoint.
Yeah, Steph, that's super helpful context. I guess the only thing that I would add to that is, that there are firms, certainly I believe we're leading the way, because, I come from the legacy Strauss Freeburg side. Now we're part of Aon Cyber Solutions, but, that have a lot of the insurance IQ. So I'll give you an example. Several months ago, we kind of saw this happening, and we reached out to many of the insurance carriers, and we said, team, what are you asking for? What are you expecting for, our clients to have in terms of controls? And what should they be doing process wise and that type of thing. So when we're advising clients, we can advise them effectively, right? Not just advise them on sort of security best practices, but make sure that there's stakeholder alignment between the security team and the risk management team or the treasurer or the finance team that ultimately is responsible for the risk transfer solution. Because what we typically find is in these renewal strategy meetings, if there is not that linkage or the security team is not aware of what the insurance companies are focusing on and how they're assessing risk of an organization before continuing to have them in their portfolio or put them in their portfolio, there's a disconnect. And so in these meetings, the security team and the technology team could be doing an amazing job, right? They're doing all the right things that they can to protect the company, based on what their partners are saying, what they're seeing the attackers do. They're keeping up with like what's happening in the security world, and they're bringing that back to defending their network every day. But then in the renewal strategy meeting, if the insurance carriers are asking very specific things, do you do this? Do you do that? How do you go about this? And the security team is not aware of that, then that could be a result of, no, we don't do that, or we haven't focused on that, but we do all these other things, and then they're not going to care, right? Because there's a very specific set of things that they're concerned about or fixated on in terms of assessing their own risk, and they want to make sure organizations are doing sort of that low-hanging fruit type stuff. And so what we've been very intentional on doing is understanding what the insurance companies want, but also, and then using that as sort of an input as we're advising clients to make sure that there's going to be stakeholder alignment between the security team, the technology team, and the risk management team. So there's a handful of firms that have that insurance IQ that are able to do that, and I would just recommend for everyone listening just to make sure that all the security leaders or what have you on the call, make sure you understand what the risk manager needs to present your organization as a good risk, just so there's that alignment.
Yep. And I see we have a question in the chat that maybe we can address real quick, if that makes sense. It's if it happens every 11 seconds, how do I know my company will get the priority from the consultants to help us? Who has priority if 10 clients of the insurance company gets hit at once? I think this is a great question. And one of the things I think, Che, you might be touching on later in the presentation, but we may as well hit it right now, which is being prepared for this and having your disaster recovery plan tested, having your vendors lined up so that you know who you're going to go to. We have a lot of clients that don't have an MSA with any forensics firms, for example. And so they don't even know if they had a breach, they wouldn't even know who they would be reaching out to right now. And the panel there's a vendor panel on the insurance policy to help direct clients, but it's always better if you have that all figured out in advance so that you know who you're going to go to, who your first choice is, and who your second choice is, and maybe even your third choice. And you have all those terms and conditions and contracts figured out with all of those vendors ahead of time. Same with legal, same with PR, any other vendor that you might need. So I think that would be my answer to the question, is have that all buttoned up in advance, and you can get there's different levels, service level agreements with regard to how timely they need to respond, but having multiple vendors lined up is appropriate at this point.
And I saw another question, I think it was from you, Mike. Yes, insurance companies do dictate, but almost all insurance companies allow you to have input into who is on your panel. And when we go into the next section, we're going to talk about that, because it's really pulling out your insurance policy, and whether you're in IT, legal, PR, looking at that and saying, what panel of experts can we choose from? What if we use a particular forensic firm for years? Let's get them on the panel. A law firm, making sure that, especially if you're in areas of healthcare, finance, Department of Defense, government contracting issues, which Christopher and I may speak a little bit about later on, you want to make sure that you're using the people that know you best and that you have practiced in advance versus going to have to use a team you know nothing about when you're in the middle of a ransomware attack. Not an ideal situation. But does anybody else, I mean, we obviously have time at the end as well for insurance related questions. Was there any other questions before we move on to our next slides? I see none and no hands, so you can still hold them to the end. Allison, if you go to the next slide. So I think a lot of you are probably wondering, why in the heck does my executive team and board care so much about cybersecurity all of a sudden? Not that that wasn't a big ticket item, but I do think that the uptick in questions related to ransomware are from a couple different things. One in particular from the White House really issued an open letter to private businesses telling them, please, we need your help. This is a huge issue and it's a legitimate issue. And this was issued to corporate executives and business leaders. I know many of my clients that, and both from the legal and from the IT side, have reached out over the past few weeks saying, what does this mean? What should we do? How should we get prepared? And frankly, dealing with ransomware is very disruptive for many reasons. One, it stops your business operations. So it gets all of your executive leaders right to the table right away because you can't function and you can't support your business lines and things are shut down. Two, you're often put in a spot, and we'll go over this in a minute, where you have to issue communications before you want to because your operations have been shut down. And three, frankly, dealing with ransom and negotiating with potential terrorists is not something that we as, good corporate citizens do on a daily basis. We're not the FBI and not the government. And so this is a new and an odd thing. And I will tell you that many CEOs, CFOs, and others feel very uncomfortable in the space. So Foley here, we issued a blog that goes into detail more on what was issued from the White House on how to prepare. But it's many of the things that Steph and Che already talked about. Che's going to go into a deep dive, so I don't want to go over all the security requirements. But I do want to note that now that we've got direct guidance from the White House about what you should be doing to prepare from ransomware, I think it's highly important that your organization look at these steps and try to incorporate all of them, if not some of them, that you can do within your cost structure. And the reason why I say that is that I really do believe these recommendations could be best, become de facto standard of care. So in the event we've seen with Colonial Pipeline, they just got sued in a class action suit, and others, that once this guidance has been put out there, many plaintiffs' attorneys are looking at that. And in the event that you have a ransomware attack and you haven't deployed some of these, if not all of these, it could be viewed as negligence. And we've done tons of sessions here at the Midwest Cybersecurity Alliance about what is best security practices. We've talked about the duty of care standard, the DACRA standard that comes out of CIS controls. That's free and available, but this is just one of those other things where it's a convergence of IT technical measures with best practices. So if you want more information about this, let us know. But I think this is where it's driving a lot of questions. And for you, all of you though, that are in-house, whether legal or IT, I would definitely take a look at this memo, and you can Google Foley has a whole blog on it. So next slide, please. What we're going to do is I'm just going to talk through high level how we on the ground handle ransomware attacks. And it's just to kind of give you a psychological insight into all of the things that you need to do very quickly. I'm going to leave the weeds to Che on the forensics. And then when we get into whether you can pay ransom or not, I'm going to have my partner, Christopher Swift, former Treasury and national security expert, really go through the weeds of how you can decide whether or not you're going to pay a bad actor. But really, these are just practical tips. At the end of the day, if you just want to know high level or provide some sort of advice to your board, these 15 different steps you could use kind of as a cheat sheet. But one, we know, and we've done tons of presentations, the best ROI you can get to help is to practice. So it's practicing doing a tabletop mock exercise on ransomware and testing your incident response plan. And that goes with your data backup plan as well, but really just practicing for ransomware and really bringing the individuals that need to make decisions very quickly to the table so that you can act very quickly when you're negotiating with terrorists and others and trying to figure out who is making the call on ransomware. So that's the main thing. 2, really looking at your cyber insurance policy to determine coverage and really the process for claims related to ransomware. You know, who are all the different individuals that have to be on your panel, whether it's lawyers, whether it's IT forensic firms, whether it's PR firms, and a new category of individuals are, you know, who is really going to be your ransom negotiator? If you have to pay Bitcoin, who would be that entity that would do that? Also, who would be running OFAC checks? Oftentimes we use these outside entities, which Christopher is going to get into detail with, and then we as a law firm double check that to make sure that you don't get any sort of issues with the US government. You want to preserve logs and other forensic data, and I just bring that out as a lawyer. Often in ransomware, people are panicked. They shut everything down. You know, they wipe systems, and frankly, it causes problems later on because yes, the immediate thing is to get you back up and running. But later on, when we have to do the forensic investigation, we need those logs. So really practicing about what would you do in the event of a ransomware attack and how do you save precious log and other forensic data that helps us as lawyers, you know, either prove or disprove what happens later on. Certainly engaging a forensic firm under attorney-client privilege is very important. We like to do this on the front end. Obviously, you'll probably have to negotiate a specific SOW related to the incident, but at least we'd have all your pieces together prior to going into a very stressful ransomware event. So we definitely want you to have that pre-negotiated. Also with your ransomware negotiators, your Bitcoin providers, your PR firms, we would like to do that all in advance so that while you're dealing with this extremely very stressful event, that you're not trying to negotiate with all of these different providers. Notifying the cyber insurance carrier, I would say, and Steph, jump in if you have any other comments on this, you know, again, you really want to understand the process in advance about what types of pre-approvals you need to get from the carrier. Many policies, you just got to simply put them on notice. You've got coverage. They don't need approvals. Whereas in other scenarios, you may need to get their approval before you would pay any sort of ransomware payment. But really working through that process in advance is extremely helpful so that you're not scrambling on the fly when you're dealing with a ransom incident. Next slide, please. One of the other issues that we see is that when you have a ransomware attack, and if it shuts down systems or other operations, you're under immense pressure to issue communications. And that could be because your entire supply chain is wondering what in the heck is happening. Why can't they get a hold of anyone? Why are applications down? Why is your website down? Why are we getting no response? And so having that communication in your back pocket ready to go is incredibly important. Usually we see things like we're under system interruption, etc. And really, we do not like to communicate more than that at the time. However, we are seeing a bit of a change where we're now seeing attackers actually go through your supply chain and also contacting your supply chain, saying what's going on. So again, preparing and planning about who would lead point on those types of communications, what is going to be communicated. Typically, it's an interruption. We may say we have an incident, but we're under investigation. We'll come out with, you know, certain types of communications when we know more. But again, this is very, very different than a malware attack, which you typically have time to do the forensic investigation and prepare how you're going to come out publicly with that. Ransomware, oftentimes you're outed before you're able to do a full investigation. Also, I see it as an issue where everyone is really concerned about getting up and operating so that you can get back to your business operations. And then the forensic investigation, while that's ongoing, really gets more delayed. And so you always have to remember that we still have to figure out what happened in the incident, meaning was data accessed or exfiltrated? Do we have notification obligations to regulators and to others? And during ransomware, it just makes it a lot more difficult because everyone's first initial focus is to get back up and running. So this is one of the struggles. I would say in the olden days of ransomware, typically the attackers would take admin credentials or pictures of system architecture. That is just not the case anymore. Ransomware attackers have realized that companies are really pretty good now about doing data backups and getting back up and running. And now they're specifically taking data, stealing data, threatening you with data, putting data out for bid on the dark web. So it really is about data. And now I cannot say when you have a ransomware attack that you won't have other notification obligations. And so you got to stay the course, get back up and operating, but remember that we also have timeframes and deadlines that we may have to go out to notification. Another thing, making sure that you're working with an appropriate forensic provider such as Stroh's and others to make sure that your backups are safe before restoring. You don't want to have the situation all over again. So really getting that outside third-party advice before you restore is important. We already covered about that really we're evolving, that ransomware is evolving to exfiltrate data. And also what you should be doing, not only post ransomware, but continuously monitoring the dark web to see if your company is being outed, your data of your consumers or others is being sold, and really doing ongoing threat monitoring services, because oftentimes you don't even know that somebody has been in your systems or stole data until one of these outside dark web or other threat monitoring services picks it up. Next slide, please. Also, we highly encourage involving appropriate law enforcement, whether that's the FBI or others, simply filing an IC3 report or involving others. In the event that the FBI or others has information that help you, can be very good. For example, decryption keys, but keeping them involved in the process is something we highly recommend, and we do often. The FBI does not reach out to regulators and tell on you about what's going on. It really is more of a supportive environment to see if they have any, types of information that may help you or your forensic team. I think on this point, though, is that you cannot rely on the FBI to essentially come out and save you. You do have to do that internally or through third-party experts to help. The FBI is just simply too busy. I have heard comments, this is like car accidents. That's how much ransomware is occurring. But we do recommend involving them at the appropriate time. We always have to analyze contractual and regulatory notification obligations. As I mentioned on the top of the hour, we have a 50-state survey of data breach laws. Again, that doesn't deal with all laws. There's requirements in the insurance industry, healthcare, whether you're in GDPR in Europe or other countries around the world, but we do have a US state data breach notification chart that is helpful background. Also thinking about board communications, how are you going to, talk to your board about ransomware? How are you going to keep that under attorney-client privilege? What are the types of things our board would want to know in a ransomware attack? Also figuring out what kind of audit or financial statement disclosures would be required. Do we actually have damages and loss that would rise to the level of materiality in reporting these events, etc. And at the end, obviously ensuring mitigation measures are implemented and conducting a lessons learned analysis post-breach, keeping that under attorney-client privilege. But if you have a ransomware event and you don't learn from it, certainly that would not be what we advise. And in this type of climate and environment with plaintiff's law attorneys, if you have an event and you don't close those gaps, they really need to be reviewed from a legal perspective and an IT perspective, because if it happens again or multiple times, you really bring yourself at risk to damages, especially under class action or regulatory enforcement actions. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to turn it over to Christopher to run through really what has been a game changer, I would say, in the last year with not only are you dealing with a ransomware attack to shut down your operations, terrorists potentially asking you to make payments, but now when you're a victim and you try to make a payment to protect your customers or others, you could be subject to U.S. economic sanctions. So I'm going to turn over now to Christopher to run through those.
Thank you, Jen. I hope everyone can hear me well on the line, despite the fact that I'm calling in from an undisclosed location today. Ladies and gentlemen, the purpose of my part of the presentation is to help answer some questions. Among those questions are, how can I, as a victim, unknowingly become a perpetrator? Another question would be, how do I know whether my threat actor is a bona fide James Bond villain? And as we go through the presentation today, we're going to present a series of issues that are mainly for your awareness. I know lawyers have a tendency to scare folks rather than providing solutions, but we'll highlight a couple issues for your awareness. But then we'll also try to give you a game plan so you can understand how to work with a law firm, how to work with your insurer, how to work with your ransom negotiator, how to work with your forensic advisory firm in order to figure out whether in the course of trying to solve a problem, namely the ransomware event, you inadvertently create another problem, which is to say violating the U.S. economic sanctions. Now, one of the things that I want to emphasize is that the sanctions that the United States government enforces are very broad. So if you are sitting at home and any of the following criteria apply to you, I'd like you to put your hand up. So first off, are you a U.S. citizen or a legal permanent resident? The answer is put your hand up. Congratulations, U.S. economic sanctions, and by extension, U.S. jurisdiction in this area follow you anywhere you go. You can be in Germany. You can be on vacation in some island, vacation spot. You can be on the bottom of the sea. You can be on the surface of the moon. If you are a U.S. citizen or a legal permanent resident, the sanctions apply to you. Turns out the same thing is true for any corporation that is incorporated under any kind of law in the United States or any other sort of organization. And the same is also true for the U.S. subsidiaries of foreign corporations. In addition, OFAC, the Department of the Treasury, and the Justice Department can get their hands into or their tentacles into a transaction if that transaction involves the United States and its territory in just about any way. So if you have a ransomware attack that occurs overseas, but nonetheless involves U.S. cloud-based servers as part of the exfiltration vector, or it involves data that's stored on a cloud-based server here in the United States, even under those circumstances, a foreign attack involving foreign parties that somehow touches U.S. networks and U.S. territory will still fall within U.S. jurisdiction. And then finally, ladies and gentlemen, anything involving the U.S. financial system, your bank accounts, correspondent bank accounts at U.S. banks overseas, foreign banks that have accounts here in the United States, any transaction involving U.S. dollars, all of those things are going to fall within U.S. jurisdiction. So if, for example, you hire someone to negotiate a Bitcoin payment, and you make that payment, and that payment originated in US dollars, which you traded for Bitcoin, and then the Bitcoin was used to pay the bad guys, congratulations, ladies and gentlemen, that falls within US jurisdiction because US dollars were involved. The bottom line is Uncle Sam can get into this space if he wants to, and he has very, very broad authority. Next slide, please. So let's talk about when and how Uncle Sam can actually use that authority, just so that we put things in perspective. Generally speaking, when we think about economic sanctions, we think about bad countries or bad governments. And you can see here, we've put together a list of, threatening countries. This is the rogue state axis of evil list here. You have Cuba, obviously, longstanding U.S. sanctions. You have Iran, public enemy number one, as we called it when I was in government service. You also have a part of Ukraine that the Russians occupy called Crimea, which is the legal equivalent of Iran if you happen to do business there accidentally. There are also two other countries that are in the news. They don't have country-based sanctions, but it's almost impossible to do business there without running into somebody who's sanctioned, like, oh, I don't know, Kim Jong-un and the North Korean regime, or the Assad regime in Syria. If you're not dealing with the Assad regime in Syria, by the way, chances are you're dealing with either a terrorist organization or the Russian military. So again, Syria is a great example of a country to avoid. And if you see that you have a threat actor that looks like they have a Syrian IP address, or they're speaking to you from a location that they claim is Damascus or some other similar garden vacation spot, you want to pay attention to that, because that significantly elevates the risk. The other thing that's really important to note here is that sanctions are not just about bad countries or bad governments. In fact, the majority of U.S. sanctions target bad organizations or bad individuals. When I say bad, of course, I mean hostile or criminal. And let me give you an example of how these lists of bad guys work. If you're part of a terrorist organization, the organization is on the list, but individual members of that organization will also be on the list. So Al-Qaeda is on the U.S. sanctions list. Osama bin Laden as an individual is also on the list. If you did business with Osama bin Laden, you would have violated the sanctions twice, because you did business with a sanctioned person, but also because that sanctioned person is part of a sanctioned organization. Well, it turns out that with cyber criminal syndicates, especially the sophisticated ones that rise to Bond villain level, they tend to be part of organizations, and they tend to be listed both as organizations and as individuals. So you can get twice as much pain out of the same inadvertent sanctions violations sometimes when you're dealing with these folks. Next slide, please. So ladies and gentlemen, we have put together a little bit of some visual aids here to give you a sense of who the worst actors in this space are. Generally speaking, they are going to be Russian-based or Russian-inspired cyber criminal networks. Not every Russian hacker or Russian hacking group or entity that is aspiring to be one is going to be sanctioned. In fact, the vast majority of them won't be. But some of them are, and I want to give you a sense of who these folks are. So here with this photo montage, we have an example of the largest cyber criminal hacking group that the United States government has targeted inside Russia. And this one is full Bond villain. This is a James Bond movie script, if ever there was one. You have an individual named Maxim Yakubits, who's been indicted by the FBI, by the U.S. Justice Department, and others.
Wow.
You've got pictures of him here with his Bond villain style spouse, his Bond villain style car, and all the various things that he's done to get himself into trouble.
Yeah.
Can folks hear me okay? There seems to be some chatter on the line. Okay,
Everyone
great.
mute, please.
So you may ask, why are we putting all of these pictures up? Well, in this instance, Mr. Yakubits and his wife, who you'll see there, she is the daughter of an extremely high-ranking Russian intelligence official. And in Russia, organizations like Evil Corp and some of the other cyber criminal syndicates, they may be private sector actors, but they're private sector actors that are operating with cover. In Russian, the term is krysha, or roof, operating under the roof provided by the Putin regime in the Kremlin. And so the part of the reason why we have Mr. Yakubits and his Lamborghini Hurricane with the police officer there is the police officer is actually helping him, even though he's a criminal. And he drives that car around in Moscow, and the license plate says thief on it. So these are people who are open, they are notorious, they are actively doing bad things to U.S. companies. Great examples include the Garmin hack from over the summer. I had 2 other clients that were also hacked last summer by this particular group. If you have one of these groups and they hack your company, right, they get in, they have access, they're demanding a ransom, U.S. law says you can't pay them. Paying a ransom to a sanctioned cyber criminal group is the legal equivalent of pay. The law, it's important to understand those risks and assess those risks as you're going through the process of trying to get back on your feet, get your company going again, and get your after action report together for the relevant agencies that might be involved. I want to go up just a little bit, just up one slide here to look at the sanctions risk. This is slide 24, Allison. I think I may have jumped ahead without realizing it. If we can look very briefly, oh, sorry, not slide 24. I wanted to look at slide 26, my mistake. So let's talk about what can happen if you inadvertently pay a group like Evil Corp. And by the way, they really are called Evil Corp. There's a popular culture reference there involving a television show called Mr. Robot, which you can probably stream on one or many different services. But if you inadvertently make a payment, a ransom payment, to one of these sanctioned Russian groups, or say to a North Korean hacking syndicate, or to an Iranian government hacking syndicate, there are both civil liability risks and criminal liability risks. And I want to run through those pretty quickly here just to give you a sense of the high risk that can sometimes be run in this area. So on the civil penalty side, the Treasury Department, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, has the ability to impose a penalty that is either $307,000 per ransom payment or twice the value of the underlying ransom payment. So imagine you had a 250 Bitcoin ransom that you were being asked to pay. That's about $9 or $10 million, depending on today's exchange rate. You pay the ransom, but you find out 2 weeks later that it was actually Evil Corp that you just paid. Congratulations, your maximum civil penalty is going to be the equivalent of 500 Bitcoin, which I believe is around $20 million. Right. So very, very quickly, a ransom payment can turn into something that is much, much more expensive, and chances are your insurance won't cover that kind of an event. The other thing that's important to note is the legal standard that the Treasury Department uses. This is the jaywalking standard or the speeding standard, right? The standard is knew or should have known. So if you knew that Evil Corp or another sanctioned bad guy was the threat actor, then you can't make the payment. And if you do, you've been negligent. And it's sufficient to be negligent in order to get these massive penalties. If you should have known, that is to say, if there's some information somewhere in your forensic files or in the public domain or something that you could have easily discovered had you done the appropriate diligence, then OFAC will also hold you liable for civil violation. Now, the good news is criminal violations, and again, that has to be brought by the DOJ, and you've got to go through court. You probably should get a defense lawyer. Criminal violations in this space are very rare, in part because you have to show that someone knew it was illegal and intended to do it anyway. It's a much, much higher standard, so we're not seeing much enforcement in this space. But in the civil liability space, I know of at least 2 cases where the U.S. Treasury Department has threatened to impose massive fines on U.S. companies in order to deter them from making payments involving sanctioned Russian cybercriminals. 2 other things I want to identify here. The first is when you're dealing with economic sanctions violations, you do have officer and director liability concerns. It's not just something that happens at an operational level. When OFAC is investigating these things, the Department of Justice is investigating these things, they're going to look very specifically and focus very intently on what senior management was doing during the breach or during the ransomware event and what kind of thinking that they were engaged in when evaluating these issues. And then the second thing to remember is that when you're dealing with these sanctions problems, if you're a public company, then sometimes that can bring in SEC scrutiny, right? If you are a defense contractor or you support customers in the U.S. defense industrial base, that can sometimes bring in some additional scrutiny from other U.S. government agencies in the national security community. So depending on who your threat actor is, whether your threat actor is a Bond villain or not, and what kind of business you're in, these issues can either be something on a checklist that you evaluate, move on from very quickly, or it can be something that can have a much broader and more serious impact on your company. Let me move to the last slide here and just walk through a survival checklist before we get into questions. So the first thing you want to do here whenever you're dealing with a threat actor of any kind is you want to be sure that your forensic team and your negotiating team and your law firm and anyone else that's supporting your company is gathering objective fact-based information about who the threat actor is and what the threat actor is doing. Simple stuff like what language they prefer to use, whether they identify themselves with a nickname, whether they're dumb enough to give you an address, whether they give you a Bitcoin wallet, right? Because every Bitcoin wallet has an identifiable number. All of those little objective facts that you pick up in the course of a discussion with or negotiation with a threat actor, and that your forensic team will pick up by virtue of their evaluation of the exploit. Those facts can sometimes tell you whether you're dealing with a run-of-the-mill criminal or somebody that's on the level of evil core. So first off, gather all those facts, get that information together, keep a record of it, and use it to screen for bad guys. The second thing is really work with your forensic team and your negotiation team closely to try to figure out what the nature of the exploit was. Certain types of exploits correlate much more strongly with sanctioned bad guys than they do with your run-of-the-mill criminal organization. So sometimes the more information you have in that space about what the nature of the attack was and how that all worked, that'll also give you a better sense of what's going on. Third recommendation is, by all means, talk to the FBI, coordinate with the FBI. Understand that the FBI is gathering information for their use, not necessarily for your benefit, but sometimes they'll be able to come in and give you some additional insight that'll help you make the determination as to whether you're dealing with a run-of-the-mill criminal or whether you're dealing with a bond felon. And then finally, if you need help, if you have questions, get help. Not everybody understands the economic sanctions implications that can arise in these cybersecurity events. In fact, even the New York Times had an article not too long ago, or a podcast not too long ago, where they said there was no sanctions risk associated with payments and ransomware events, which of course is something that's not true. So if you need help, find an OFAC lawyer or a national security lawyer. Make sure that they're on the same team with your cybersecurity lawyer and with your outside vendors, your outside negotiators, and your forensic team. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Christopher. That was just amazing. We appreciate it very much. As all these pieces are constantly changing with new threat actors, the OFAC piece is just something that just adds salt to the wounds through the process. So thank you for that great overview.
Yeah, that's very right. This is one of those rare areas of the law where you can do the right thing from a cybersecurity perspective and in terms of a business continuity perspective, get yourself up and running, and then find out weeks later that you paid somebody that shouldn't have been paid. Now, I also want to emphasize that most of our clients who found themselves in this situation, Jen, have been able to get themselves up and running without needing to pay a ransom. So they've been able to avoid this issue. But those that haven't have been in a very, very difficult place. And it just goes to your point earlier about having backups, you know, running those tabletop exercises, being prepared, because sometimes the bad guy is not just a bad guy. Sometimes they're a sanctioned bad guy, and that really changes the game.
Yeah, now with data exfiltration, it's hard too, because companies are in a position of what do we do when data of our customers or consumers is out there for sale? And of course, that's why the attackers have evolved to that point. So now we're going to turn it over to Che, and this is more of our technical focus. Although, I mean, nowadays, all of us that practice in all areas need to be aware that of these technical terms so that you can, if you're a lawyer or risk manager or CFO or in another role, a lot of this terminology is definitely in our ecosystem and you should be trained on it and understand what it is. But now Che's going to go through more of the technical aspects of getting prepared.
Thanks, Jen. Really appreciate that. And I realize we're at 4:54, so I promise to be brief on the slides, and certainly we can have a more thorough conversation if you're interested.
Shay, you have time. We have a whole nother half hour, so
Okay.
so
Okay,
take your time.
Wonderful. I didn't know if we wanted to leave time for questions, but that's helpful. So Steph talked about the rigorous underwriting processes that the carriers have been leveraging now to really, again, assess their own risk and overall portfolio risk. They're asking a lot of tough questions just to make sure that they're doing their due diligence. And Steph also talked about some of the controls that they like to see that organizations have. So what we've been hearing a lot from our clients is, are we doing the right things? Do we have the right controls? But are there gaps that maybe we're missing that need to be addressed? And so they've been reaching out, with these types of questions, in addition to also wanting to understand what the carriers are asking for. So what we've been seeing, what we've been advising a lot of our clients to do is, in addition to the typical assessments that have been done for many years, whether you're assessing against a NIST framework or an ISO framework or a very industry specific framework, that's all good, but a lot of those assessments don't actually go into the specific things that attackers are doing to launch or to conduct their ransomware attacks. It's not as technical and focused as some of the other things that are out there. And so what we're advising our clients to do, if they're really wanting to answer these questions of, are we doing the right things? Do we have gaps? Are we missing things? Is really to assess against, a security framework that's very much focused on the attacker sort of life cycle and what they do. So in this particular case, we're kind of presenting, a kill chain model, which I think many of you have probably heard about, that sort of describes, what an attacker typically does. And then we kind of ascertain whether or not we have the right controls in place within the organization. Sometimes we're missing controls, sometimes we've got it, and all is good. But just because we have these controls does not mean that we're going to be in a good spot with respect to mitigating a cyber incident from occurring, or making sure that we're going to be in a good spot, again, to present ourselves as a good risk to the insurance companies. So I'll give you an example. One of the questions that the insurance companies will ask specifically around email security is, is sender policy framework, SPF, enforced on all incoming emails, right? So you may have an email security solution in place, whether that's Proofpoint or Mimecast, or there's a gazillion others, but again, there's some specifics that they're really focused on with respect to ransomware. Give you some other examples. Access management. We've talked a lot about MFA, and years ago, the insurers would say, do you have multi-factor authentication? Are you using it? Okay, that's great. But now they're actually going into a little bit more detail, right? They're asking, do privileged accounts require multi-factor authentication? Is multi-factor authentication turned on for all of remote access, whatever it is that you're using, and is it turned on for some users or all users, right? They'll ask questions like, do you have an audit trail or a log of privileged account use for at least 30 days, right? So not only are they focused on the authentication of these devices, but are you actually capturing what an administrator is doing on that particular box, and is it in fact, meaning the logs, going to some type of central logging aggregator that hopefully is being monitored for potential nefarious activity or that type of thing. So when it comes to network security, they're asking questions like, what percentage of the enterprise is actually covered by vulnerability scans, and how often do you do it? Or another very good question that they'll ask is, is network traffic being monitored for anomalous or potentially suspicious data transfers, right? And that goes back to, Jen's points earlier of data access or data exfiltration. Is the organization able to identify whether or not data is in fact leaving the organization, whether it's in small chunks or big chunks, to a destination that essentially it should not be going to. So 2 points I want to make here is that just because the carriers are recommending that you have these 9 critical security controls, it's not really the catch-all in terms of controls when you're dealing with ransomware. And then secondly, you really need to understand the types of questions that they're going to ask, in addition to just working with your trusted partner to understand what are the specific things that should be activated or looked at to really, again, mitigate the risk of a ransomware attack from occurring. Next slide, please. I wanted to, and I kind of just talked about this, but I wanted to just, elaborate a little bit further into the different, attack lifecycle sort of standards and things that are out there. Because again, clients it really depends on where they're at with their journey, right? If they feel like, they've made a lot of advances, they've done a lot of good things, and they don't necessarily want to pump up the volume all the way, but they really want to do sort of that assess and get an idea of where they're at. Maybe the kill chain, right, makes a lot of sense in terms of understanding the attacker's potential surface and the controls that you have in place. Wanted to just mention that there are other attack frameworks like MITRE, specifically MITRE ATT&CK and MITRE SHIELD. In addition to what's called MITRE Defend, which was just released this week. There's also, MITRE, attack frameworks for Office 365 and Azure, and the list goes on, depending upon what it is that you're using. And so, if we go to the next slide, what we're actually doing now with those clients that are a little bit more mature is, we're combing through all of the different sort of, stages that an attacker will take when they're actually launching their attack, right? So the first thing an attacker will do is want to get to know your organization, right? So they'll actively scan. They're going to find ways to gain, victim information. They may look at your website. They may phish or spear phish. To get information. They're going to do as much recon as they can. There's a treasure trove of information on the deep dark web. Credentials galore of employee that employees are using, right? Because there might have been a third-party breach somewhere. There's chatter and collaboration now between different threat actor groups. So there's just a lot of information about a lot of different companies. I'll give you another example. We worked on an incident response situation for a private equity firm in one of their portfolio companies, one of their portcos. And, the incident response was directly with the portco. As we were concluding that matter, we had activated, to Jen's point, threat intelligence monitoring, not only on the portfolio company, but other portfolio companies in that private equities portfolio. And what we found was existing chatter between threat actor groups saying, look, we just, we got paid X amount of dollars for intruding into this organization. We sold this access to another threat actor group that was responsible for the actual installation of the ransomware. And then there was chatter about, other companies in the portfolio, right, that they were going to then target, because now they had a little bit of intel in terms of, what the negotiation was in terms of the ransomware amount and how long it took and that type of thing. So they had an idea of sort of how the private equity, firm would handle that type of situation. So they were sort of approaching it as a wash, rinse, repeat type situation. And through threat intel monitoring, we were able to identify that and then proactively notify the private equity firm and the portfolio firm that was actually found, and then start to think about defenses to protect that private equity in addition to their portfolio companies. And then attackers will very much be focused on sort of how they're going to get initial access and how they're going to execute, how they're going to build their persistence, and the list goes on and on. And so what we've been advising organizations to do, depending upon where they're at in their maturity, if they already have these controls in place and they've spent a lot of time configuring and optimizing that, and they really want to get into sort of the technical detail as to what attackers do, typically within their phases, then we're recommending that they sort of align to an attack framework like MITRE or something else to identify where there potentially are gaps. So as we're working with our clients to do this type of work, some of the things that we'll see is with respect to lateral movement or pushing out their malware, one of the main things that they'll use is something called PowerShell, which is sort of an embedded tool within sort of the Microsoft network operating system. And so we'll look at, okay, well, an attacker absolutely can use PowerShell. Do we want to lock that down? Do we want to have that a little bit more restricted? So we'll ask the company, how are you guys using PowerShell? Right? And they may say, well, we're not really using PowerShell, or they may say we are, but in this context, and we'll say, okay, let's lock that down to limit the risk of a particular attacker from leveraging full-fledged access to PowerShell to push out software. When it comes to lateral movement, we may say, there are tools that can be leveraged on the network, and the company may already have a lot of those tools or a lot of those products. But just having an understanding of sort of what attackers are doing to move laterally into a company, right, and having that discussion with us, they may want to activate some of the features in those controls to prevent the risk of lateral movement from occurring. We see a lot of companies even that are lifting and shifting to the cloud. If they have a flat network and they're lifting and shifting to the cloud, well, guess what? They're going to have a flat network in their cloud-based environment. Well, that's again a very significant attack surface that could be leveraged by an attacker to do bad things. When we look at authentication and access control and these types of things, and what administrators are doing on different systems, well, there are controls that can be leveraged to require sort of that multi-factor authentication, but limit what somebody can do on a system. So if an attacker does in fact, gain access to, an admin's credentials, which they can, we see it all the time, right? All they have to do is spearfish a particular administrator. The administrator clicks on that, they download a payload onto the machine, and now the attacker has access to the cached credentials of that on that user's endpoint. So they bypassed MFA. Now they have access to these cached credentials and potentially what that user is logged into, and they bypass that. So the point is that it's really important, depending upon where you're at in your journey, to take it a step further and kind of align your defenses and what you're doing and your strategy to what attackers are typically doing. To make sure that you're identifying gaps and you're filling those gaps. So if an attacker is in fact successful in one step or one phase of the attack, you significantly prevented them from being successful in sort of the next phase or the next step of the attack, and hopefully you can catch it and limit the amount of exposure that has on the company. I'll mention one more thing here because I hear it often from clients. They'll say, well, Che, this is great. We do pen testing, right? We do infrastructure pen testing, and the vendor that we're using will align with an attack framework like MITRE or something of that nature. And what I would say to that, and what I always say to clients is, you absolutely must do penetration testing, because it really gives you the assurance that what you're doing are good things, right? You're going to be able to have the right defenses in place to mitigate, hopefully, something bad from happening. But remember, Penetration testing is very scoped. It's very specific. It has a very narrow end goal. And so when firms like us or other great providers that are out there that are doing this type of work, we're very focused on something versus where we're actually helping organizations with these types of MITRE assessments, because it gives us a little bit more freedom to kind of look through all these different things and identify gaps versus a very specific objective of what can we do from the outside in, or if we were to get in, what can we do now once we're inside of the organization. So very, very different objectives. One is very scoped, one is very narrow, whereas when we're aligning to attack frameworks, we can literally comb through these things and sort of map that to the technology stack within the company and identify what makes sense to actually leverage or turn on, or what architectural changes maybe need to be made in order to mitigate the risk of something bad happening. Next slide, please.
And Jay, before we jump to the next slide, I just want to jump in here and announce 2 of the CLE course codes for any folks who are seeking CLE credit for today's program. I just want to make sure I do that before, in case people accidentally jump off before they get those codes. So let me do that real quick. For those who are seeking CLE credit, I did provide a link to the attorney affirmation form that we will need from you. So we'll need you to fill that out in its entirety, and also record the following 2 course codes on that form before you email it back to my attention. The first of the 2 codes is, both of these are a combination of letters and numbers. The first is Y8KEO. That's the letter Y as in yellow, the number 8, the letter K as in Kenneth, the letter E as in Edward, and the letter O as in Oscar. Again, that's Y8KEO. And then the second and final course code for CLE today is 275TT. That's the number 2, the number 7, the number 5, and the letter T as in Tom, and the letter T as in Tom again. So that's 275TT. Again, just make sure you fill that form out, send it back to me via email at your convenience over the next week or 2, and we will get you covered. All right, thanks. Right back to you, Jay.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. Next slide, thanks. So another thing that we recommend that clients do with respect to just mitigating risk around a ransomware attack from occurring is whatever email environment you're using, whether that's Office 365 or you're using a Google solution or you're using a hosted Exchange solution, provided by a particular provider, or just on-prem Exchange. The point is that spear phishing, we all know that's a major vector to get into companies. We always recommend to kind of assess that environment, because a lot of the documentation that Microsoft and Google and other solutions will provide are phenomenal when it comes to actually implementation of the solution or configuration of the solution. But they tend to lack when it comes to a lot of the things that we care about from a security perspective, or even just an investigation perspective. Right. So one of the things that we get brought in to do is lead these business email compromise investigations, or the list goes on. And a lot of times, the company, will not have the right logging verbosity turned on, or they may not have the right enterprise license to be able to answer a lot of the fundamental questions that are going to be asked of us. Right. Did an attacker actually access this mailbox? Did they exfiltrate data? A lot of times we just don't have that logging, right? And so we have to assume the worst. And so Jen's going to ask us those questions from a counsel perspective, because obviously she and her partners are thinking about, whether or not there needs to be data mining and e-discovery and things of that nature that's a follow-up of the investigation. So we always recommend that first, that there's a full assessment to make sure that we can support an investigation, but also that the right controls are in place with respect to identity and access management, right? Making sure that identities are hardened by enforcing the principle of least privilege access and just-in-time access. There's monitoring going on, what's called, advanced threat protection, that we're looking at safe attachments and safe links, and authentication is configured optimally, in addition to protecting SharePoint and OneDrive and Teams. In addition to just making sure the right controls are in place from a data perspective. And there's sort of the native DLP solutions and things of that nature that are being leveraged. So that's going to be really important, is to make sure that yes, you are using Microsoft's documentation to implement, but you're also having, a firm like us, or there's many other great firms that do this type of work that can kind of assess that and make sure that it's hardened from a security perspective, and also that the configurations are optimized to produce the information that we would need to be able to conduct a thorough investigation. Next slide, please. Another thing that we as a firm recommend often to our clients is you got to do incident response readiness, right? So let's just say that everything that we've been talking about in terms of these controls have failed, and the attacker was able to get in and do something bad. We identified it, we caught it. You got to do all the things that Jen kind of talked about early on with respect to having a plan, and folks need to understand their roles and their responsibilities. There's got to be playbooks, right? We see organizations having plans, but they don't have playbooks, right? So I'll give you an example. A lot of the incidents that I work on, the security team may understand their role, the technology team may understand their role, the general counsel may understand a little bit about kind of what decision making they're going to have to make, but maybe the CFO is not aware of their role, right? So they're gonna wonder, okay, well, we have an incident. When do we disclose the fact that we've had this incident? If the incident happened a week before, you've got to release the financials, out to the investment community. Do we notify? Do we disclose, via an SEC 8K that we've had an incident, or do we wait? What's really the definition of sort of materiality and impact? When do we do that? Another thing, CFO may be concerned about is, auditors will say, okay, well, we need to have some assurance that, the integrity of your financials are there, right? So, we'll want to understand from the incident response firm a little bit more about the incident and whether or not the financial data was in fact compromised. But another question that we get often, again, from CFOs are, do we institute a trading blackout, right, for officers and directors? Because in light of Equifax, we saw that the CISO faced an enforcement action as a result of trading because of their knowledge of the incident. So sometimes the decision has been made after the due diligence of just making sure the threat actor is not on an OFAC sanctions list, that yes, we're going to pay the ransom because we have no other choice but to do that. And we're communicating with the threat actor that this is going to happen. But then the CFO reaches out to the financial institution and says, hey, we're going to wire X amount of dollars to our, to the firm that's going to facilitate payments, to the threat actor. And then the financial institution has their own OFAC compliance checks. And, they may have some due diligence that they do, which could take some time to actually, get the payment to the threat actor. So there's just a lot. Go ahead.
Che, this is Christopher. If I can just weigh in there on that really important point you've made about reaching out to a third-party financial institution. More often than not only will that third-party financial institution have their own compliance and diligence requirements, but those U.S.-based financial institutions are incentivized to go to the Treasury Department and other enforcement agencies first and throw their own customers under the bus if they think a sanctions-related event might occur. So not having that prior planning in place with respect to the Treasury team, the CFO, the CEO, and others We actually had that happen in a breach over the summer with a client we were supporting, and it got very uncomfortable with the banks very, very quickly. And Treasury got involved, not because the client had reached out to Treasury, but because the client's banks reached out to Treasury.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Thanks, Chris, for mentioning that. That's really well said. You know, and lastly, I'll just mention another thing that we typically see with CFOs. You know, that they're really chartered with, you know, one of the many things that they do is making sure that obviously there's the integrity of the financials, but also maintaining the operations, right? The financial operations and they have financial stewardship, right? Of the organization, right? Maintaining assets and liabilities and making sure the integrity is there and the operations is there. You know, if the ransomware attack has affected the systems that are used by, you know, the CFO or just even other critical stakeholders, how do they do their job, right? For 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks. So there's, you know, playbooks are really important, but to the point of IR readiness, what I really want to hone in on just quickly is systems readiness. So we see a lot of companies doing, you know, again, plans and tabletops, but they really don't assess whether or not the systems that they've invested in and the technologies that they've invested in have been configured optimally to capture the things that forensic firms like us care about. So we get questions like, do we know patient zero? Do we know how the attacker got in? Do we know if data was exfiltrated? Do we know if the attack came in from a third party? Do we know if they're still in here, right? There's a lot of questions that are going to come our way. And what do we rely on? We rely on forensics, we rely on logs, and we rely on other network context that's going to be provided in order to put the pieces of the puzzle together to really understand the picture so we can subsequently communicate the results of our findings to the leadership and you know, ultimately to the board, right? And so IR readiness, you may have the best technologies within the organization, but if you're not configuring them to have capture the right context or have the right verbosity for logs, that could be very problematic for the company. Next slide, please. And then I just wanted to quickly talk about information governance because we see this a lot. If data was exfiltrated from the organization and the threat actor says, hey, we want $25 million, otherwise we're, you know, to Jen's point earlier, we're going to put all your data on the internet. And not only that, we're going to shame you. We're going to tell everybody that we contacted you on this day, you dragged your feet. We gave you an opportunity to pay. You didn't take it seriously. Like they're threatening to shame you, right, on their blog if they have one or what have you. One of the questions that is often asked is of us, okay, forensically, where do you see data leaving? From which servers, which infrastructure, where do you see data leaving, and how much data do you see leaving? Because the threat actor is saying that they've exfiltrated 11 terabytes of data. Is that true? Did they really exfiltrate that much, or did they exfiltrate 5 terabytes of data or 1 terabyte of data, right? Are they bluffing? And yeah, the threat actors, you know, as we're negotiating with them through our partners, you know, they'll provide what's called proof of life samples. So they'll maybe provide some of the sampling of the data that they took, or maybe a file listing from the server in which they took the data from. But you're not going to have access to everything. And so one of the things that we see leadership struggling with is, what do we know about the data that's been exfiltrated? You know, because that would help us know whether or not we care about the data and we should pay, or we don't care about the data and we'll just let it be. So we always encourage our clients to understand where they have data, what their high value assets are, to understand their critical business processes, because that's going to help us, you know, work with them to get the most critical systems up and running. But because to the point made earlier, you know, ransomware situation is very stressful, right? We have to do our forensics, we have to investigate, we have to understand what happened because that informs the remediation, that informs the containment, that informs our strategy. But we also have to get critical systems up and running too, right? And so a lot of times businesses don't know, they don't have that priority on what would be the first thing that we focus on, right? And where is data moving, and what are the dependencies of those systems? So information governance and really understanding business processes and how data is moving, high value assets and things of that nature can be very helpful, because when we're doing the forensic work and we see, we see, at least on this particular server, 3 terabytes of data left. What is this server and what is its purpose? Because there's a sound information or data governance program, and that can assist in the breach response, that can assist with e-discovery and data mining, that can assist with business continuity and sort of crown jewels identification. The list goes on and on. And so that's something that we see a lot of organizations just not having some maturity on, is just understanding the data and the information in their environment and how it's actually governed and what are the critical systems. Next slide, please. And then these are just forgive me for sort of the loud aqua color, but these are just some of the things that we also recommend, not really part of critical path, but things that organizations absolutely should be thinking about in terms of, like, maturity and gap assessments, and what does our program look like, and do we have the right policies? Like, for example, if we've classified data as such, do we have the right policies and standards in place that are going to support how we configure our controls, whether that's configuring controls on the firewalls or on the, within the Office 365 environment or whatever it is that you're using. All of that stems from the governance, right? The policies and the standards. And so there has to be those types of conversations and agreement in order to turn that on the controls, because remember, the controls are just enforcing the governance that's been set within the company. And then lastly, if we can move to the next slide. We're talking to a lot of clients these days because it's top of mind for everybody. And so, we would be willing to get on a call with anyone here within MCSA and just kind of talk through what we're seeing in your particular industry or vertical. What we see specific threat actors doing, right? We're one of the largest incident response firms in the world, so we have pretty good pulse as to what's happening. Happy to chat with you and expound upon the topics that I talked about. Also want to offer, we have a security evaluation tool that we typically charge for, but we'd like to offer that at no charge for MCSA members, where you can self-evaluate your security posture with respect to domains around incident response and insurance and network security and application security, and the list goes on and on. We also have some ransomware bundles that we've put together, again, to kind of bridge that divide between the insurance companies and the security team. So if you're interested in talking through that, we can certainly do that. And to the point made earlier, there are absolutely things that you want to do early on to make sure you're prepared and get access to responders immediately. At least get a $0 incident response retainer with us or somebody else. Because you get that paper in place, you have access to responders versus if there's an incident that's affecting everybody out there, small, medium, and large companies in all industries, at least you can get access to help in a swift manner. Jen, that really concludes my slides. I know I talked pretty quickly here in the last few slides, but wanted to make sure we got through the presentation.
I mean, Che, that was just excellent. So thank you so very much. And, what we're going to do, we're open for questions and happy to chat about anything, but we obviously will send a follow-up email with the slides, ability to be able to watch this again. Please take Che up on any sort of offer to reach out. You know, I know that many boards, and like I said before, executive management this is a real hot issue for them. So if you need some further information that's customizable to your business, you know, please reach out and let us know. We're happy to set up another call. I mean, each sort of sectoral or sector space is different. I mean, if you're in the Department of Defense and you have those issues versus healthcare versus financial institutions, you know, everything comes with a different flair. So we're happy to provide you additional information, but we're open for questions. Don't be shy. You know me in person when you see me. I run around the room and ask, but, you know, please, if you have any questions, let us know. Whether you feel comfortable doing it now or follow up by email, we're happy to help. And please stay tuned with us. We'll be in communications with all of you that have signed up in our normal mailing list about our topic areas for the fall. If there's anything in particular you want to hear about further, please reach out and let us know. If you want to be a sponsor, please feel free to reach out. But all of us need to try to do our best to help our organizations rebuff these attacks. It makes me sick to watch companies go through this. It's just very difficult on an organization. So please do whatever you can to make your lives easier in the event you have the unfortunate luck to experience one of these attacks. But thank you all very much. And we'll stay on the line for another minute or two.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Great questions throughout. Well, I think with that, I'd like to thank our speakers again from Aon and Stroh's and Christopher Swift, who is on vacation, but is called in emergencies all the time on these national security issues. We thank everyone, and we'll see you in the fall. Enjoy your
Thank you.
summer.